The proposition was as sharp and cold as a winter wind across the Dakota plains. It wasn't whispered with courtship or tenderness. It was declared a statement of fact laid bare under the unforgiving sun. For Esther McGregor, a widow clutching the deed to a failing ranch and the hand of her small son, the words were both a profound insult and terrifyingly her only salvation. A Lakota warrior, a man whose people were meant to be her sworn enemies, stood on her porch, his shadow falling long and dark into her home. He wasn't asking for her hand. He was proposing a treaty, a contract of flesh and blood that would shatter every rule she had ever lived by and rewrite the meaning of family on the frontier. The silence was the first thing that broke you. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a settled home. It was a hungry, listening silence. It seeped into the rough-hewn logs of the cabin Jacob had built, filled the empty space at the dinner table, and screamed from the vast, unending prairie that surrounded Esther McGregor's homestead. For 6 months since the fever had taken Jacob with a speed that felt like theft, that silence had been her constant companion. Her world had shrunk to the size of 160 acres of stubborn dirt, a handful of scrawny cattle, and one small tow-headed boy named Thomas. At 7 years old, Thomas had his father's serious eyes that now followed his mother's every move with a quiet, unnerving worry. He knew they were in trouble. The corn was stunted, a predator had taken 2 of their 3 chickens, and the nearest neighbor, Mr. Henderson, was a 2-hour ride away, a ride Esther couldn't risk leaving Thomas alone for. The town of Providence, a dusty collection of clapboard buildings, a half-day's journey east, was no help. The men there looked at her with either pity, which felt like being buried alive, or with a greedy, calculating glint in their eyes. The worst was Arthur Sterling, a portly rancher, with a sprawling property that bordered hers to the south. He had already made 2 offers for her land, each one lower than the last, his tone implying he was doing her a favor by taking the burden off her delicate feminine hands. "A woman alone can't tame this land, Esther," he'd said, his thumb hooked in his waistcoat. "It's a man's work." That morning, the silence had been broken by the frantic barking of their dog, Patch. Esther had grabbed the heavy Winchester rifle from its pegs above the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd expected a wolf, or perhaps one of Sterling's men, trying to spook her cattle. She found a man on horseback, sitting perfectly still at the edge of her property line, watching her cabin. He was Lakota. There was no mistaking the high cheekbones, the long braided black hair, or the stoic set of his jaw. He wasn't wearing war paint, but his presence alone was a declaration of war on her peace of mind. Stories from Providence were filled with tales of raids of families lost. Yet he didn't move. He just watched a sentinel carved from the prairie itself. For an hour she'd stood on her porch rifle in hand until her arms ached. Finally, he'd nudged his horse forward, stopping a respectful distance from her rickety porch steps. He dismounted, and he was taller than she'd thought, lean but powerfully built. He wore buckskin trousers and a simple cotton shirt clearly bartered for. There were no feathers, no overt signs of the warrior she feared, but he moved with a fluid grace that spoke of a life of absolute physical competence. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was a low rumble, his English surprisingly clear with only a slight musical cadence that marked it as learned. "State your business," Esther said, keeping the rifle leveled at his chest. Patch growled from behind her skirts. The man's dark eyes flickered from her face to the rifle, to the small face of Thomas peering from behind the doorframe. He gave no sign of fear or aggression. He simply observed, cataloguing the worn-out dress she wore, the desperation in her eyes, the protective clench of her jaw. "My name is Caleb," he said. It was a Western name, an offering of peace, a bridge across the chasm of their two worlds. I have watched your land for 3 weeks. Your fences are weak. Your cattle are thin. You have one son. Each statement was a stone dropped into the well of her fear. He had been watching her. The thought sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Get off my land," she ordered, her voice trembling slightly. He ignored the command. His gaze was direct, unwavering, and utterly devoid of the pity or greed she was used to. It was something else, something far more unsettling, appraisal. He was measuring her just as he had measured her land. "You need a man," he stated. "Someone to work the fields, to hunt, to protect this place from men like Sterling." Esther's breath hitched. He knew Sterling's name. "I don't need anything from you." She spat, though the lie tasted like ash in her mouth. "And I," he continued as if she hadn't spoken, "need a wife." The word hung in the air, so preposterous, so outrageously impossible that for a moment Esther thought she had misheard. She stared at him, her mind racing. Was this some cruel joke, a prelude to violence? "I am the last of my bloodline," Caleb said, and for the first time, a flicker of something raw and personal entered his voice. "The sickness took my wife. The soldiers took my brothers. My people are scattered on the reservation, waiting to die. A man's legacy is his children. My sons cannot grow strong on government rations and despair." He took a half step forward, and she instinctively tightened her grip on the rifle. He stopped. "You are strong," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "You haven't run from this land. Your husband built a good house. You have his fire. Your son is healthy. You need protection and help to make this land live. I need a wife to bear strong sons who will know how to live in this new world on this land with the blood of the Lakota and the name of a white man." He paused, letting the full weight of his proposal settle upon her. It was brutal in its honesty, a transaction stripped of all sentiment. It was the most insane, terrifying, and logical thing she had ever heard. He looked past her, at the small, worried face of her son. "I need a wife, and you need strong sons," the Lakota warrior declared to the lonely widow. "I will work this land. I will hunt for your table. I will protect you from any man, white or red, who tries to harm you. I will be a father to your boy. In return, you will be my wife. You will give me sons. It is a good trade." Esther stood there, the heavy Winchester, suddenly feeling like a useless twig in her hands. The silence that rushed back in was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of an impossible choice. He was offering her survival, but the price was everything. She was everything she had ever believed. It was the surrender of her past, the desecration of Jacob's memory, and a leap into a future so alien she couldn't even begin to imagine it. And in the depths of her despair, a terrifying thought took root. He was right. The answer did not come in a rush of acceptance. It came 3 days later, born of cold biscuits and colder fear. A coyote had managed to get into the chicken coop, leaving nothing but a flurry of feathers and a silence where clucking should have been. That same afternoon, 2 of Sterling's men had ridden along her southern fence line, slowing their horses to stare at her cabin with insolent smirks. They didn't do anything, but their message was clear. We are watching. We are waiting. That night, as Thomas slept, Esther sat at the rough-hewn table, Jacob's tintype picture in her hand. She stared at his smiling, hopeful face, and for the first time, she spoke to him, not as a grieving wife, but as a desperate partner. "I can't do it, Jacob," she whispered into the gloom. "I can't hold this place. I can't protect our boy." The photograph offered no answers. The past was sealed in silver, and tin silent and unhelpful. The next morning, she saw him. Caleb was sitting on his horse at the same spot on the property line, as if he had never left. He wasn't hunting, he wasn't scouting. He was waiting. For her. With a heart like a lead weight in her chest, Esther walked out to meet him. She carried no rifle this time. She stopped 10 feet from him. "I will agree," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "On my terms." Caleb's expression did not change, but she saw a subtle shift in his posture, a release of tension she hadn't even noticed he was holding. He inclined his head. "Speak them. This is a partnership, a business. Nothing more." She began the words, sounding rehearsed and frail against the vastness of the prairie. "You will have a room in the barn, not in the house. We will not share a bed. Not until this land is secure and my son is safe. Not until I say so." It was a foolish, desperate attempt to hold on to some sliver of herself, of her old life. She expected him to scoff, to ride away. A wife in name only was not what he had offered. To her surprise, he simply nodded. "The land and the boy first. It is right. A foundation must be strong before you build the house." The simple poetry of his words unnerved her. She pressed on, needing the cold comfort of rules. "You will not treat Thomas as your own. You are not his father. Jacob was his father." This time, a flicker of something disappointment crossed his face before being extinguished. "I will teach him. I will protect him. He will call me Caleb. It is enough. And the town," she said, her voice dropping. "Providence. We will need supplies. No one will accept this." She gestured vaguely between them at the impossible gulf that separated a white widow and a Lakota man. "I have traded with the fort south of here," he said. "They trade with any man who has good pelts. We will not need Providence for much." It was all so practical, so logical. He had thought of everything. She felt a wave of dizziness, a sense that she was being carried along by a current far stronger than herself. And the sons you want." She asked the words, feeling like treason on her tongue. His gaze was steady. "When the corn grows tall, when the cattle are fat, when the boy laughs without looking over his shoulder, then we will speak of sons." And so the treaty was made, not with ink and paper, but with quiet words spoken under an indifferent sky. Caleb's arrival was less a disruption and more an immediate seismic shift in the rhythm of the homestead. The first thing he did was mend the fences. He didn't use the rotting wood and rusted wire Esther had been patching together. He rode out and returned hours later with his horse laden with young, pliable saplings, which he wove into the existing posts, creating a barrier that was both stronger and more flexible than what had been there before. He worked with a silent, focused efficiency that was mesmerizing. There were no wasted movements, no hesitation. He taught Thomas how to set snares for rabbits, not with cruel iron traps, but with cunning loops of twine that the boy could manage himself. He showed him which berries were safe to eat and which roots could be boiled for tea. He never raised his voice, never showed impatience. He simply demonstrated his large, capable hands, moving with slow precision for the boy to follow. Thomas, who had been a ghost in his own home, began to come alive. He followed Caleb everywhere, a small blonde shadow, trailing a tall, dark one. He didn't call him Papa. He called him Caleb as instructed, but he spoke of him with a reverence that twisted Esther's heart. In the evenings, Caleb would take his meal on the porch steps, respecting the boundary of the house she had drawn. Esther would eat inside with Thomas, the open door between them, a symbol of their strange new reality. Sometimes she would watch him as he sharpened his knife or repaired a piece of tack, his face serene in the twilight. She learned the landscape of him, the harsh line of his jaw, the network of fine scars on his forearms, the way his eyes were always moving, always scanning the horizon. He was a part of this land in a way she and Jacob had never been. They had fought it, tried to beat it into submission. Caleb seemed to listen to it, to move with its rhythms. The inevitable confrontation with Providence came 2 weeks later. They were running low on flour and salt, and Esther knew she couldn't put it off any longer. She insisted on going alone. "It is not safe," Caleb had stated, his voice flat. "It will be less safe if you come with me," she countered. "Let them think I've just hired a hand. It's better that way." He didn't argue, but as she hitched their old wagon, he pressed a small, intricately carved bird into her hand. "Give this to the storekeeper, Mr. Peterson. Tell him it is from the man who sold him the black pelt beaver last winter." Providence was just as she remembered, dusty and judgmental. The moment she stepped into Peterson's mercantile, the low murmur of conversation ceased. All eyes were on her. Mrs. Henderson, her nearest neighbor's wife, gave her a thin, pitying smile. Arthur Sterling was there, standing by the counter, his bulk filling the small space. "Esther!" Sterling boomed, his voice oozing false concern. "We were getting worried about you out there. Haven't seen you in weeks." "We're managing Arthur," she said, her chin held high. "I heard you have some help," he said, his eyes narrowing. "A stray, I believe." The word meant to demean hung in the air. Esther's hands tightened into fists. Before she could retort, she remembered the bird in her pocket. She placed her list and the wooden carving on the counter. Mr. Peterson, a balding man with nervous eyes, picked up the bird. He turned it over in his hands, his expression changing from apprehension to surprise, and then to a grudging respect. He looked from the bird to Esther, and a silent understanding passed between them. The man who had traded the rare, valuable black pelt beaver was not some common stray. He was a man of substance, a provider. Peterson cleared his throat. "Afternoon, Esther. What can I get for you?" Sterling watched the exchange, his face darkening with suspicion. He had been so sure she would come crawling to him, begging to sell. This small act of defiance, this hint that she had found a resource beyond his control, infuriated him. As Esther loaded her supplies, Sterling approached her wagon. "You're playing a dangerous game," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "That land is meant for good white folk. You bring a redskin onto it, you're inviting trouble you can't handle, not just from me, from everyone. It's my land," Esther said, her voice shaking but firm. "Who I hire is my business." "He's not just a hired hand, is he?" Sterling sneered. "I see the way you're fixing your fences. That's not a drifter's work. You've made a deal with the devil, Esther McGregor, and the devil always collects his due." Riding home, the flour and salt felt like stones in the back of the wagon. The treaty she had made with Caleb was no longer a private arrangement. It was a public declaration. She had chosen her side. And in a town like Providence, on a frontier that was still a battlefield of cultures, there was no middle ground. She had drawn a line, not of barbed wire, but of allegiance, and she could only pray that the man sleeping in her barn was strong enough to defend it. Life on the homestead settled into a new, fragile rhythm. Days were measured by the sun, and the work, a language both Esther and Caleb understood perfectly. The barrier between the house and the barn remained a silent testament to their arrangement. But the space between them, as people, was shrinking, worn away by shared labor and the quiet moments that punctuated it. Esther learned that Caleb's silence was not one of emptiness, but of observation. He noticed things she had overlooked for years. He showed her how a particular patch of soil which she'd deemed useless was perfect for growing squash because of the way the morning sun hit it. He pointed out the subtle shift in a hawk's cry that signaled a coming change in the weather. He was teaching her to read his land in a way she never had before. One sweltering afternoon, while they were digging a new irrigation trench from the creek, her shovel struck a rock, and the handle slammed into her ribs, knocking the wind out of her. She gasped, stumbling back, a sharp pain lancing through her side. Instantly, Caleb was there. "Let me see," he said, his voice calm but insistent. "I'm fine." She gritted out her hand, pressed to her side, her pride stinging more than the injury. She didn't want his help, his pity. He gently but firmly moved her hand aside. His fingers, surprisingly soft for a man who worked so hard, probed the tender area. His touch was professional, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt through her that was anything but. She found herself holding her breath. "It is only bruised," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "But you work too hard. You carry the weight of two." "I have to," she said, her voice defensive. "You do not." "Not anymore," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "We are partners." The word hung between them, heavier than it ever had before. That evening, as he ate on the porch, she brought him a cup of the herbal tea he'd shown Thomas how to make from the roots by the creek. She said nothing, just set it down beside him, and retreated back into the house. It was a small gesture, but it felt momentous, a crack in the wall she had so carefully constructed. The threats from Sterling, however, began to escalate from whispers to actions. One morning they awoke to find the new trench Caleb had dug, filled with rocks and filth, the water flow choked off. Another time, the gate to their small pasture was left open, and they spent a frantic half-day rounding up their few cattle from the surrounding hills. There was no proof it was Sterling, but they both knew. He was testing their defenses, a wolf circling a campfire. Caleb grew more watchful, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He began teaching Thomas how to use a bow, not a toy, but a small, powerful weapon he crafted from a willow branch. "He's too young for that," Esther protested, watching as Caleb adjusted Thomas's small hands on the bowstring. "He is not too young to be a target," Caleb replied without looking at her. "In this world, a boy must learn to protect himself. Jacob would have taught him to use a rifle. I will teach him what I know. A silent weapon is sometimes better." The cold logic of his words silenced her. She was watching her son be shaped by two different worlds, by the legacy of a dead father and the pragmatism of a living protector. The true crisis arrived not with a bang, but with a letter. The circuit rider, a weather-beaten man who brought mail once every few months, delivered it. It was from St. Louis. It was from Jacob's younger brother, Samuel McGregor. Esther's hands trembled as she read the letter. Samuel, a banker who had always disapproved of Jacob's foolish adventure out west, had heard rumors. He didn't say how, but news traveled in strange, distorted ways. He wrote of his concern for her and Thomas, his Christian duty to his brother's family. He announced that he was coming to set things right and bring her and the boy back to the civilized world. He was coming. Here. A wave of panic washed over her. Samuel was the embodiment of the world she had left behind, a world of starched collars, rigid rules, and clear lines between right and wrong, between us and them. He would never understand her arrangement with Caleb. He would see a savage in his brother's home and a fallen woman for a sister-in-law. That night she found Caleb by the creek, staring into the water. The moon was high, silvering the landscape. "My brother-in-law's coming," she said, the words tasting like poison. "From St. Louis." Caleb turned to her. In the moonlight, the planes of his face were stark. He waited, He thinks I am in danger. He wants to take me and Thomas back east." "Are you in danger?" Caleb asked, his voice low. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "But not from you. I'm in danger from men like him. From men like Sterling. They want to put me in a box, tell me what my life should be. You just want me to survive. I want more than that," he said, and the intensity in his voice made her look up. "I told you. I want a wife. I want sons." "This is not a marriage, Caleb," she reminded him, the old defensiveness rising. "Is it not?" he challenged, taking a step closer. "We share our food. We protect our home. We raise a son together. We fight the same enemies. What do you call that, if not a marriage?" He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from him. She could smell the scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to him. He reached out not to touch her, but to trace the faint, silvery scar on her temple from a childhood fall. "You have scars, Esther McGregor," he murmured. "From your life before me. I have them too." He gestured to a long, faded scar that ran along his collarbone, disappearing under his shirt. "This one is from a crow arrow. This one," he touched a small, puckered mark on his wrist, "is from a soldier's bayonet. They tell the story of who we are, of what we have survived, our partnership. It is another scar, a mark that shows we chose to live when it was easier to die. Your brother will not understand this." Her heart was hammering. He had never spoken to her like this, with such raw, personal honesty. He wasn't just the capable protector or the pragmatic partner. He was a man who had lost everything just as she had, and was now fighting to build something new from the wreckage. "What are we going to do?" she asked the question a plea. "We will do what we have always done," Caleb said, his gaze holding hers in the moonlight. "We will work. We will watch. And we will be ready." He didn't need to say what they would be ready for. Samuel's arrival would be a different kind of attack. It wouldn't be fences cut or wells fouled. It would be an assault on the very foundation of their fragile world, an attempt to tear it apart from the inside. And unlike Sterling's men, Samuel would be invited right through the front door. Samuel McGregor arrived in a hired buggy from Providence, a cloud of dust and righteous indignation heralding his approach. He was the opposite of his brother in every way. Where Jacob had been broad-shouldered and tanned from the sun, Samuel was soft and pale, his city suit and starched collar looking absurdly out of place against the raw backdrop of the prairie. He burst out of the buggy before it had fully stopped his eyes, scanning the homestead with undisguised horror. "Esther! My God, what has become of you?" he cried, rushing toward her as if she were a castaway on a deserted island. Esther, who had been anxiously waiting on the porch, stiffened at his tone. "Samuel, it's good to see you." The lie was brittle. His gaze swept past her, landing on Caleb, who was calmly sharpening an axe by the barn, his movements slow and deliberate. Caleb did not stop his work, but Esther could feel his awareness, his coiled readiness. Samuel's face contorted in a mask of disbelief and disgust. Is that him?" He hissed, his voice low and venomous. "The savage you've let onto my brother's land. His name is Caleb," Esther said, her own voice hardening. "And he is my partner. This is my land now, Samuel." The confrontation she had dreaded was here, and it was uglier than she had imagined. Samuel ignored her words, his eyes fixed on Thomas, who was standing near Caleb watching him work. "Thomas, come here, boy. Get away from that man." Thomas looked from his uncle to Caleb, his face a mixture of confusion and fear. He took a hesitant step toward the porch, but his gaze remained on Caleb, who still hadn't looked up from his work. The first few days were a quiet, suffocating war waged within the walls of the small cabin. Samuel moved in, taking the spare cot as if it were his right, filling the space with his disapproval and his incessant critical chatter. He lamented the state of the cabin, the quality of the food, the wildness that had crept into his nephew. "Look at his hands, Esther," he'd said one evening, grabbing Thomas's arm to display his calloused palms. "He's turning into a little ruffian. In St. Louis, he'd be learning Latin and sums. In St. Louis, he'd be an orphan in someone else's house." Esther retorted, her patience worn paper-thin. "Here he's learning to survive. He's learning to be strong." "Strong?" Samuel scoffed. "He's learning to be a heathen. I saw him this morning sitting with that man, not speaking, just watching a bird's nest. For an hour, it's unnatural." Samuel made it his mission to save Esther. He spoke endlessly of Jacob invoking his memory like a weapon. What would Jacob think, Esther? To see his home, his wife, his son, given over to one of the very creatures he fought to protect you from. It was a cruel blow, and it struck home. Did she know what Jacob would think? In her darkest moments, she feared Samuel was right. Jacob had been a good man, but he was a man of his time. He saw the world in black and white. Samuel's presence drove a wedge not between Esther and Caleb, but between Esther and her own past. He represented a life of safety, of society, of belonging, a life she had once cherished. But listening to him now, it sounded like a cage. The tension came to a head over the rifle. Jacob's prized Winchester. Samuel found it one afternoon, while Esther was out checking the snares with Thomas. When she returned, she found him cleaning it on the porch, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "It's time we had a real man protecting this house again," Samuel declared, not looking at her. "I saw fresh tracks down by the creek this morning. Wolf, maybe. Or worse." He glanced meaningfully toward the barn where Caleb was mending a harness. "Caleb can handle any threat," Esther said coolly. "Can he?" Samuel sneered, snapping the rifle's action shut with a loud crack. "I am a McGregor. This is McGregor land. The protection of this family falls to me." Later that day, the dog started barking frantically. A large timber wolf, its eyes yellow and hungry, was stalking the edge of the tree line, clearly eyeing their last remaining cow. "Get Thomas inside!" Esther yelled, her heart leaping into her throat. Samuel, seizing his moment, grabbed the Winchester. "Stay back, Esther. I'll handle this." He ran out into the yard, his movements clumsy and agitated. He raised the rifle, trying to take aim at the wolf which was weaving between the trees. He was a banker, not a frontiersman. His stance was wrong, his breathing erratic. From the barn, Caleb emerged. He held Thomas's small bow and a single steel-tipped arrow. He moved not with frantic haste, but with a lethal calm, melting into the shadows along the fence line, circling around to get a better angle. Samuel fired. The shot was loud, echoing across the prairie. It missed the wolf by a good 10 feet, kicking up a spray of dirt. The wolf, startled, broke from the cover of the trees and made a dash toward the terrified cow. Samuel fumbled to reload, his hands shaking. Damn it! At that exact moment, there was a soft thwip sound, barely audible over the ringing in Esther's ears. She saw a flicker of movement. The arrow loosed from Caleb's bow flew in a silent, perfect arc. It struck the wolf high on the shoulder. The animal yelped, stumbled, and fell, its charge broken. It wasn't a killing shot, but it was precise, crippling. The wolf dragged itself back into the woods, leaving the cow unharmed. Silence descended. Samuel stood frozen, the smoking rifle in his hands, his face a mask of shock and humiliation. Caleb straightened up from his crouch by the fence, lowered the bow, and looked not at the wolf but at Samuel. In that single silent moment, everything was laid bare. The loud, ineffective bluster of Samuel's civilized world versus the quiet, deadly competence of Caleb's. Samuel had brought noise and fear. Caleb had brought safety and precision. That evening, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken truths. Samuel sat staring into the fire, the rifle leaning uselessly in the corner. "He saved our cow," Thomas said, from the table, his voice small but clear. "Caleb did. With my bow." Samuel flinched as if struck. Esther looked at her brother-in-law, and for the first time, she felt not anger, but a profound pity for him. He had come here to be a hero, to rescue his family from a savage. But the savage had just saved him from his own incompetence. The ghost of Jacob McGregor, which Samuel had tried so hard to conjure, seemed to finally fade in the face of the living, breathing man who was actually protecting his family. "You should go home, Samuel," Esther said, her voice gentle but firm. "There's nothing for you here." His head snapped up, his eyes filled with a desperate, wounded pride. "I will not abandon you to him." "You're not abandoning me," Esther said. "You're just finally seeing that I don't need rescuing." But Samuel McGregor was a proud man, and his pride had been deeply wounded. He would not go home. Not yet. He would find another way to prove he was right, a way to tear down what he could not understand. And Esther knew, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that his next move would be far more dangerous than a badly aimed rifle shot. The humiliation of the wolf incident settled deep in Samuel McGregor's bones. Here McGregor had been shown up by a savage on his own family's land. His clumsy posturing with the rifle had been rendered foolish by the silent, deadly competence of Caleb's bow. His pride, the currency by which he measured his world, was bankrupt. He could not accept this new reality. If he could not best Caleb through skill, he would do so through the sheer force of society's rules. Ignoring Esther's desperate pleas to leave things be, Samuel hitched the buggy the next morning. His jaw was set with a grim, righteous determination. "I am going to Providence," he announced, his voice cold. "I am going to find men who understand the proper order of things." "You're going to Arthur Sterling," Esther accused, her heart sinking. "You're making a deal with a snake to get rid of a man you don't understand." "I'm going to get help," Samuel retorted, "before it's too late. I am saving this family from a mistake that will destroy it." He snapped the reins and rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving Esther with a cold knot of dread in her stomach. He returned late that afternoon. He was not alone. Arthur Sterling and 3 of his ranch hands rode with him, their faces set in grim, self-satisfied expressions. They were a small posse, an unofficial jury riding to enforce an unwritten law. They reined in their horses in the yard, a tangible threat of violence hanging in the air. Samuel, to his credit, looked deeply uncomfortable, as if he were already beginning to regret his decision. "Esther," Sterling boomed, taking charge. "Your brother-in-law has explained the delicate situation you're in. We're here as neighbors. We're going to escort this man off your property." Caleb emerged from the barn, drawn by the commotion. He wasn't armed. He simply stood there, his presence a quiet challenge, his eyes moving from Sterling's men to Samuel, who pointedly avoided his gaze. "This is my property," Esther said, her voice shaking but firm as she stepped in front of Caleb, shielding him. Thomas peeked from behind her skirts, clutching her dress. "You are not welcome here. Leave now." Sterling chuckled a low, condescending sound. "It stops being a private matter when you invite a wolf into the fold. We have standards in this community. Now be a good girl and stand aside." "Stand!" Before anyone could move, a terrifying flicker of orange erupted against the twilight sky. One of Sterling's men, who had quietly circled around behind the barn, had set a torch to the small haystack. The dry hay went up with a roar, the flames leaping instantly to the old dry timber of the barn wall. "The barn!" Esther screamed. The fire was the signal. In the ensuing chaos, one of Sterling's men, a burly ranch hand named Peters, lunged for Caleb. He had fatally underestimated his opponent. Caleb moved with the fluid grace of a cornered predator. He sidestepped the clumsy charge, using the man's own momentum to send him sprawling into the dirt. As Peters fell, Caleb disarmed him, seizing the heavy cattle prod he had been carrying. Sterling roared in frustration. "Forget him! Get the cattle, run them off!" Two of his men spurred their horses toward the small pasture, whooping and yelling, trying to stampede the few animals Esther and Caleb had worked so hard to protect. While Esther and Thomas grabbed buckets and began a frantic, hopeless-looking effort to fight the fire, Caleb moved to intercept the riders. He was on foot, but he used the terrain, weaving between the woodpile and the water trough. He swung the heavy prod like a club, striking one of the horses on its flank. The animal screamed and reared, throwing its rider. The second horseman, enraged, charged directly at Caleb. Caleb stood his ground. At the last possible second, he dropped low and swung the prod hard against the horse's front leg. The animal went down with a sickening crack, trapping its rider beneath it. Caleb fought not with rage, but with a chilling efficiency, disabling his opponents without killing them. Sterling, his face purple with fury at the sight of his men being systematically dismantled, drew his pistol. "I'll kill you myself, you red devil!" He took aim at Caleb's chest. A single sharp gunshot cracked through the air, but it wasn't from Sterling's gun. Sterling cried out, his pistol clattering to the ground as he clutched a hand that was suddenly slick with blood. Everyone froze. Standing by the porch, his face ashen with shock at his own actions, was Samuel McGregor. He held Jacob's Winchester, a thin plume of smoke rising from the barrel. He had shot Arthur Sterling. In a moment of truth, faced with the ugly reality of the violence he had unleashed, he had chosen a side. Stunned and bleeding, Sterling stared at his hand, then at Samuel in utter betrayal. The remaining ranch hand, his nerve broken, helped his boss onto his horse, and the disgraced posse retreated into the darkness, leaving a trail of curses behind them. The immediate danger was over, but the barn was still burning. Without a word, a new alliance formed in the smoky yard. Esther, Caleb, Thomas, and a stunned, silent Samuel formed a desperate bucket brigade. They fought the flames together, a single unit against a common enemy. By the time they finally subdued the fire, half the barn was a charred, smouldering ruin. They stood panting in the yard, covered in soot, their faces illuminated by the dying orange glow. Samuel began, his voice a ragged whisper. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "What did you think would happen, Samuel?" Esther asked, her voice weary and drained of anger. Caleb walked over to the man still pinned by his dead horse. He looked down at the groaning rider, then back at Samuel. He showed no triumph, no malice. "Get the buggy," Caleb said, his voice calm and clear. "We will take this one to the fort. The doctor will treat his leg." He then looked at the ruin of the barn, at the mess of their lives. "This is how we survive," he said, his gaze meeting Esther's through the haze. "We clean up the mess, and then we rebuild. Taller, stronger." The aftermath of the attack was a landscape of bruises and smoke. The immediate threat from Arthur Sterling was gone, but the air remained thick with tension. The burned-out section of the barn stood as a grim monument to the violence. Samuel McGregor was a changed man. The fire seemed to have burned the arrogant certainty out of him, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell of shame. He worked alongside Caleb, clearing the debris, his soft city hands quickly becoming blistered and raw. The two men barely spoke, but in their shared labor, a silent, grudging understanding began to form. A few days after the fire, Samuel found Esther by the creek. "I was wrong," he said, the words coming out in a pained rush. "About everything. I came here, pretending to honor Jacob's memory, but I almost destroyed everything he built. He would have been proud of how you fought for this place." "Jacob is gone, Samuel," Esther said softly, her voice weary but not unkind. "We have to live in the world as it is not as we remember it." "I know," he admitted. "I'm leaving in the morning. I'll ride to the marshal in Deadwood and file a formal complaint against Sterling. It's the least I can do." It was his penance, an attempt to mend what his pride had broken. Esther nodded, relieved. One battle at least seemed to be over. But the frontier was never so simple. Just as one threat receded, another emerged from a direction she had never anticipated. A week after Samuel left, a fragile peace had settled over the homestead. They were rebuilding the barn, and the air was filled with the clean scent of freshly cut timber. Suddenly, their dog Patch began to bark a low, guttural warning that raised the hairs on Esther's arms. Caleb froze his hand, tightening on his hammer. He scanned the horizon, his body instantly alert, every muscle coiled. "Take Thomas to the house," he said, his voice quiet and deadly serious. "Bar the door. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." Esther saw them then, 4 riders emerging from the distant hills. They were not settlers. They were Lakota, in full traditional dress, their faces streaked with paint that seemed to absorb the midday sun. They carried lances and bows, and they rode not with the aimless drift of travelers, but with the stark, terrifying purpose of men on a mission. Heart pounding, Esther grabbed a bewildered Thomas and ran for the cabin. She slid the heavy wooden bar across the door and peered through a crack in the shutters, her rifle clutched in her hands. The 4 warriors reined in their horses, forming a semicircle around Caleb, who stood alone in the yard. One of them, who appeared to be the leader, had a fearsome scar running down his face. He began to speak to Caleb in the rapid, sharp sounds of their native tongue. Esther couldn't understand the words, but the tone was universal. It was a lashing judgment, a string of accusations. The leader pointed his lance at the half-rebuilt barn, at the cabin, at the small herd of cattle. He was condemning Caleb's world, everything he was building. Caleb stood his ground, his answers short and clipped. His posture was proud, but Esther could see the immense strain he was under. This was not a fight with Sterling's thugs. It was a reckoning with his own people. The leader grew more agitated, gesturing angrily toward the cabin. Esther knew with chilling certainty that he was talking about her and Thomas. They were the proof of Caleb's betrayal, the white woman and her son, the symbols of his abandonment. Suddenly, with a piercing war cry, the leader spurred his horse forward, his lance leveled directly at Caleb's chest. It happened so fast, Esther didn't have time to scream. Caleb, moving with lethal grace, dropped his hammer and snatched a heavy log from the pile they'd been working with. As the horse bore down on him, he swung the log not at the warrior, but at the horse's front legs. It was a brutal, desperate move. The animal screamed and stumbled, throwing its rider hard into the dust. The other 3 warriors let out a collective cry and surged forward, their weapons raised. Caleb did not run. He stood over his fallen kinsman, the log held ready. He shouted something in Lakota, a single powerful word that stopped the others in their tracks. He was not pleading. He was commanding. A tense, vibrating silence fell over the yard. The fallen leader rose slowly, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. He and Caleb locked eyes, a long, silent battle of wills fought in the dusty yard. Finally, the leader spat on the ground at Caleb's feet, an act of ultimate contempt. He remounted, his horse said a few last venomous words, and wheeled the animal around. Without a backward glance, he and the other 3 warriors rode away, disappearing back into the hills from which they came. That evening, Caleb finally came to the cabin. When Esther unbarred the door, he stepped inside, crossing the threshold of the house for the first time without an invitation. He looked older, wearier than she had ever seen him. He sank down at the table, burying his face in his hands. "His name is Stoneheart," Caleb said, his voice muffled. "We were boys together. His sister, she was my wife." The confession landed with the force of a physical blow. The man who had just tried to kill him was his family. "They cannot understand," Caleb continued, raising his head. His eyes were filled with a profound sorrow. "They see me here with a white woman on land the government gave you. They see a traitor who has forgotten his people and our ways." "What did you tell them?" Esther asked softly. "I told them, my people are gone," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I told them, I honor our dead, by living, not by starving on a reservation. I told them, my sons will be born on this land, and they will be a bridge between 2 worlds." He looked at her, then his gaze raw and vulnerable. "They called me a dreamer. They said my children would be ghosts belonging nowhere." The pain in his voice was a physical thing, a wound far deeper than any lance could inflict. He had defended his new life, but in doing so he had been cast out from his old one. He was truly alone now, stranded on an island of his own making. "They are wrong," Esther said, her voice fierce with a conviction that surprised her. She reached across the table and for the first time laid her hand over his. His skin was rough and calloused, but warm with life. "They will not be ghosts. They will be our children. They will belong here, with us." His fingers curled around hers, his grip tight and desperate. In that moment, the last wall between them crumbled into dust. The terms of their contract had been rendered meaningless, replaced by a bond forged in fire blood and a shared defiant hope for the future. The departure of Stoneheart's war party left a different kind of silence on the homestead. It was not the hungry silence of loneliness, nor the tense silence of a standoff. It was a quiet born of acceptance, a settling of dust after a great storm. Caleb had faced the ghosts of his past and chosen his future. Esther had faced the judgment of her world and defended her present. What was left was the simple, difficult business of living. News eventually trickled back from Providence, carried by a sheepish Mr. Henderson, who came to offer his apologies and a sack of potatoes. Samuel McGregor had, true to his word, gone to the territorial marshal. Faced with a formal complaint from a respectable St. Louis banker, Arthur Sterling's power in the community crumbled. He was forced to sell off a portion of his land to pay fines for his actions, his reputation shattered. Providence, in the fickle way of small towns, quickly decided that Esther McGregor was not a pariah, but a woman of formidable grit. They left her alone, which was all she had ever wanted from them. Life found its rhythm. The barn was rebuilt stronger than before. The corn, nurtured by Caleb's patient hands, grew tall and green. Thomas, now confident and capable, moved easily between his 2 teachers. He learned to track and hunt with Caleb, and he learned to read and write with his mother in the evenings. He was the living embodiment of the bridge Caleb had spoken of. The space between Esther and Caleb had disappeared completely. He moved his few belongings from the barn into the house without a word being spoken. It felt natural, inevitable. He slept on the cot Samuel had vacated, but the geography of the small cabin no longer mattered. Their lives were intertwined, their partnership absolute. One evening in late summer, as a warm breeze rustled the cottonwood leaves, they sat on the porch watching the last rays of sun paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Thomas was asleep inside. "The corn is tall," Caleb said softly, not looking at her. Esther's heart gave a little flutter. It was a phrase from their original treaty, spoken so long ago, it felt like another lifetime. When the corn grows tall, when the cattle are fat, then we will speak of sons. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet. "The cattle are fat too." He turned to her, then his dark eyes searching her face in the twilight. The question was there unspoken, the final clause of their contract. But it was no longer about a contract, about a trade for protection and legacy. It was about the man and woman they had become together. Esther thought of Jacob not with the sharp pain of fresh grief, but with a gentle, bitter-sweet sadness. She would always love the man who had brought her to this land and given her a son. But her life with him was a closed book. Caleb was her present, her future. He was the man who had seen her not as a helpless widow, but as a survivor. He had stood with her against everything and for everything. She stood up and held out her hand to him. "It's getting late," she said. "We should go inside." He took her hand. His grasp was strong, certain. He stood, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other, a universe of understanding passing between them in the quiet of the evening. He followed her into the cabin, and she closed the door, not on the world outside, but on their pasts, leaving them behind in the encroaching darkness. Their children, when they came, would not be ghosts. They would be born of this stubborn soil under this vast Dakota sky. They would have their mother's fierce resilience and their father's quiet strength. They would carry the names of white men and the blood of the Lakota. They would be a new kind of tree on the prairie, their roots sunk deep into the earth of two traditions, their branches reaching for a common sky. And they would be strong. The story of Esther and Caleb is more than just a tale from the Wild West. It's a testament to the human spirit's incredible capacity to adapt and overcome. It reminds us that family isn't always about shared blood, but about shared battles, shared burdens, and the shared hope for a better dawn. In a world determined to tear them apart with prejudice and violence, they chose to build a bridge, forging a new identity in the heart of the unforgiving frontier. Their legacy wasn't just in the land they tamed, or the children they raised, but in the powerful idea that even in the most divided of times, survival and even love can be found in the most unexpected of alliances. If this story of love, loss, and survival moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share it with someone else who loves a powerful, dramatic story that feels like it was pulled right from the pages of history. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more tales from the American West. Your support allows us to keep these incredible stories alive. Thank you for listening.